Noddy, I want to go straight to you in New York. Anthony Albanese had a lot on his schedule this week, but his big sort of ticket event, I suppose, was that he spoke to the UN General Assembly as a debut speaker. It was kind of the first time he'd done that. It was probably the biggest deal for him as a leader to address the UN. What did he sort of try to convey in that speech? What was the job of that speech?
Yeah, this was a significant moment for the Prime Minister, as you say. Since he was elected in 2022, he hasn't appeared at the UN, he hasn't spoken, he hasn't been a part of this world. So this was a significant moment for him.
The shared mission and purpose of the United Nations is not merely to contain the threat of war, it is to create the conditions for peace, to provide a framework for settling our disputes, to foster the dialogue that enables us to manage our differences and deepen our understanding.
His speech contained some newsy elements. I think particularly the fact that Australia is going to make a serious bid for a non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council.
Colleagues, it is not the Australian way to try and impose our values on other nations. But when we deal with the world, we bring our values with us and we strive to back our words with actions.
He was also pitching Australia's bid for the COP climate summit.
Australia is acting to meet the environmental challenge of climate change while working to seize and share the economic opportunities of renewable energy,
which is really coming to a head now. And so I think when you put those two together, what you can see is that he wants Australia to have a more influential role in these big global forums. He believes that the United Nations needs to be reformed and improved, but he believes in it. He's coming at it from a place of someone who believes in multilateralism. His speech was very much about the UN as an important body that needs to be made better, particularly for a country like Australia that's not a superpower. And also thinking about countries in our region like the Pacific, we need the United Nations to be working. It was quite a dark speech in some ways about the times we live in which dictators are on the rise. There's terrible wars happening around the world. We're battling disinformation. So he was really pitching Australia as a progressive middle power that can play a constructive, productive role in the world. And there was a big focus on climate change in the speech, which is noticeable because it's a very different take than Donald Trump's speech the day before.
Yeah, look, it was an interesting speech, wasn't it? Because he did make references, very non-specific references to tyranny and sort of the rise of anti-democratic forces.
In 2025, we are confronted by all manner of these challenges in old forms and new. Dictators whose hold on power derives solely from their capacity for cruelty to their own citizens. Tyrants who invade sovereign nations to further their own ambitions. Regimes willing to crush their own people beneath the weight of oppression.
All the stuff that we're really worried about coming out of America, let's be honest. But, I mean, was that a bit of a sort of controversial thing to do, right in the home of Donald Trump himself?
I must say I read those passages more thinking about Vladimir Putin. That's how I was interpreting them, perhaps even Xi Jinping. I think it's clearly in the recent days the climate issue where there's this big difference with Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump has never believed in climate change at all. He hasn't changed his view. But he was really passionate about it in his speech. For example, Australia and the US also disagree on recognition of Palestine, but Trump spent much more time just berating nations who believe in climate change, who think renewable energy is a good thing, just speaking about it as a complete joke.
It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion. Climate change, no matter what happens, you're involved in that. No more global warming, no more global cooling. All of these predictions made by the United Nations and many others, often for bad reasons, were wrong. They were made by stupid people.
Now, that's such a big contrast with Albanese, who's arrived here with new ambitious climate targets, and a lot of his time has been taken up with meetings about climate change. He went to speak to a New York Times event today on climate change. This has been his focus. So I think that's where we're seeing such a big difference with the US, and a big difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, which just a year ago, there was an administration in power in Washington that really believed in climate change and was wanting to make something happen.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned Palestine. Obviously, the other major thing that happened this week was that Albanese joined in this conference, which was co-hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron, and they officially recognised Palestine.
Recognising the aspirations of the Palestinian people is about more than a seat, a voice and a vote in the councils of the world. It is about real hope for a place to call home.
Paul, I want to go to you, down to the nitty-gritty realpolitik in Canberra. Do you think that act of diplomacy, what will it do for the government's sort of domestic standing? Do people care? Will they give him credit for it? Will they deduct credit for it?
Well, I think it's worth asking, would the Prime Minister have spent a week in New York talking about the Palestinian question before the last election? The answer's probably not. He's more unencumbered. There's a totally different dynamic with the federal opposition now. Peter Dutton was much more fierce on this issue. He set the Palestine question up as a test of Albanese's mettle on national security and social cohesion. The politics around that have largely been stripped away. Also worth noting that the international winds on this issue have changed significantly over recent months. Albanese is now freer with his big win and big mandate to reflect the kind of mainstream position among Western democracies now, which is that what's going on in Gaza should come to an end. The atrocities have been in our faces for a long time, and he feels freer to go and do that. I think could easily be pitched by his opponents as a little bit of virtue signalling on the Palestine issue. On the more pragmatic side, as Noddy mentioned, the climate change question is something that the government sees as a real tangible win they can extract from this trip. Climate change is not pitched as a solely environmental issue when the government speaks about it on the world stage. It's pitched as an economic issue. And to meet those climate targets, which we've announced last week, which are quite ambitious despite some critics saying otherwise, we need a huge amount of private capital to be invested in Australia. And the green transition is really the biggest game in town in financial markets. So Chris Bowen going over there, meeting with investors, Albanese spruiking Australia's transition and our intent in that space is as much about attracting capital and making Australia an attractive place to invest as it is about any environmental concern.
Susan Lee also put her 2 cents in on the Palestine question. So she wrote to a bunch of Republicans and said basically this is not the bipartisan position in Australia to recognise Palestine. And I think she even said that it was not, it didn't necessarily reflect the will of the Australian people. Penny Wong was really cross about that. She was evidently very annoyed. She almost tried to make out that it was somehow seditious of Susan Lee to go against the official foreign policy. Noddy, what did you make of that? Was it really that big of a deal?
It is extremely unusual. It was a little strange to be here at the UN headquarters with all these heads of state and leaders weighing in on the big issues of our time, and then hearing about what an opposition leader who has incredibly little power or influence or prospect of
even
being
within her own party
anytime soon, and a tenuous grip on power in her old party, giving her and the coalition's view on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But Penny Wong is annoyed because this isn't the way foreign policy usually operates. You know, sometimes there are disagreements, but for Susan Lee to be writing to Republican members of Congress to undercut and undermine the government's official position is really unusual. Yes, it does show what little influence she has. But the government and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, they've appeared very confident in their position. I was thinking as we saw them, Penny Wong and Albanese stand at a press conference and confirm that this change, which was really announced a month ago, was going into official effect, just how much they presented this as a totally common sense, unremarkable move that anyone would approve of. He was talking about, there's Israel and Palestine. It's not Israel and Marrickville. Of course, we're going to recognize them both. Whereas this has been an issue that has been agonized over, and the government has agonized how to do this and when and how to make a difference, and will it just be a gesture or will it not? All those doubts have been washed away. And I think of it in the same way. The government talks about taking climate change seriously as the price of admission in the Pacific. I think they now see recognizing Palestine as the price of admission really to play a productive role in that part of the world, in the Middle East, that so many countries now are moving. We're not doing this in an isolated way. Canada, France, the UK, there's talk about what is going to happen in Gaza after the war. Emmanuel Macron is talking about an international stabilization force. There's a lot of discussion about how the world will help Gaza. And Anthony Albanese is putting Australia in a position where we can play some role, while, as they always come back to, we're not a central player in that part of the world.
So, Paul, I want to ask you about that, because when we were talking earlier this week offline, you sort of made the point that for the better part of 2 years, Albanese has fended off both left and right on this question of Palestine by basically saying that whatever we do, recognising Palestinian statehood or not, it won't make much difference because we're not a major player. So why has he changed his tune? Has he changed his tune? What's going on?
I think there is an inherent contradiction in what's happened this week in terms of how he's put this at the centre of his travel to New York. As you said from our conversation earlier in the week, his key line to critics on the left and right, both of which were very vociferous in their criticism of him for the past 18 months, was that, no, we're not going to do more to support Israel, Peter Dutton, because we're not a central player there. We can support the Jewish community in Australia without making noises internationally to do more on the Israeli side. And to the Greens on the left, who wanted greater sanctions, who have made all kinds of calls for Australia to make tangible action to end the war effort in Gaza. His argument is that we have no economic ties to Israel and an important but not hugely influential voice diplomatically in the Middle East as well. So that's been his key retort back to arguments to do more here. This week, putting at the centre of his travel this Australian role in this emerging peace plan, I think contradicts that political line that he used. It perhaps shows that political line was nothing more than a political line, that there actually was potentially more Australia could have been doing the whole way through. It also probably reflects what I mentioned earlier, that the international winds have changed. There is a now nearly global consensus in the West, putting the US to one side, that the only way to get Netanyahu to change course is to put maximum pressure on. So that circumstances have changed. I think the Prime Minister's probably also searching for, in his second term, a way to boost his image as a bit of a statesman, to make a big international pitch that elevates himself from just purely a domestic politician. And I think he sees what Macron and Starmer are doing on the world stage as attractive. There are really different circumstances for Macron and Starmer, though. They're both facing terrible turmoil domestically and are in very powerless positions, the two of them, whereas Albanese is in a terrific position domestically. And as he has made the point many times privately and publicly, most Australian people, even though there is a significant group of people who are worried about what's happening in Gaza, his judgment has been that most Australians don't want to see an active Australian role here. Yet, in spite of that, he's now tied himself rhetorically and in a potentially tangible way through what Noddy mentions about this peacekeeping role. He's tied himself to this potentially doomed process that may not succeed, given the circumstances on the ground, going in the other direction, potential annexation of the West Bank, escalation in Gaza. So I think there is risk there and also contradiction.
And just to add, if I could quickly, we're even seeing Penny Wong was talking about how Australia is going to partner with Indonesia really to help rewrite the curriculum in Palestine. So we're getting involved to that level of detail. And this also comes on the back of some, at least it's short-term failures in the Pacific, in our very own part of the world, to strike agreements. So that's been very obvious that we're getting very involved in the Middle East while things aren't going so well in our region. And just when you're talking about Susan Ley before, So the most recent polling we did, which was a straightforward question, you get different results depending how you ask it, but our polling found that around 30% of Australians supported recognition, around 30% opposed, and the rest were undecided or didn't have a strong view. So that really shows, I think, a split population. It doesn't show that there's overwhelming opposition to it, like Susan
No,
might be suggesting.
I felt that she misrepresented that polling, because the way that I read it was, that 30%, as you just said, but the group in the middle was sort of like open to Palestinian
They haven't taken
recognition.
an interest in it.
Yeah.
It's not the main issue for them.
Yeah, which is, as the government has judged it, I suppose. So basically you're saying with Albanese, he's trying to sort of evolve or grow into this role where he takes a greater interest or a greater role in international affairs and take up some of these huge international issues that we're dealing with, like Palestine, like climate change. So there's a risk and a reward there for him, I suppose. But Noddy, how's he seemed in this week, being in the United Nations? Like, you will have seen him at close quarters. Can you just set the scene for us a little bit? Does he seem relaxed? It must be very daunting, I would have thought, for most people to meet these huge world leaders like Macron, and even, not to mention Trump. He got a selfie with Trump, which was interesting. How's his demeanour been?
Well, yes, and I think to understand what it's been like being on this trip and covering it is that there's two parallel universes operating at once. The reality of being here in the United Nations and what's actually happening in terms of those meetings and the conference. Then there's been the story of whether he's going to meet Donald Trump. And
we haven't even gotten into that
going
yet.
to happen. So the two things have been running at the same time and interacting with each other. So a big story has been, will he get a meeting with Trump or will he not? Will that make the trip a failure or not? Is it going to happen now? Is it going to happen at the White House? We had confirmation yesterday that there's going to be a separate trip in October to the White House. And so even throughout all that, the Prime Minister has appeared really relaxed and really at ease, really comfortable in what he's been saying. He hasn't seemed under pressure, and that was interesting to several of us when it was unclear what was going on with this Trump meeting. He didn't seem anxious about that, and I think that's because they knew, obviously working on it behind the scenes, that this was probably going to come off, and he wasn't having to worry about an imminent meeting with Donald Trump this week, which would be something you'd really want to prepare for, and as we saw in Trump's speech, could be quite fascinating depending on what he decides to talk about. But he does have a meeting locked in, so I think he's happy. He's happy about that. Yeah,
he's feeling relaxed about that. I mean, it could go either way for him, I suppose, on October 20 when he goes to the White House to meet Trump.
Yeah, that's an issue for that.
Yeah, that's tomorrow Albo's problem.
I think the political calculus on how he sees the US relationship is probably revealed by the decision to post the selfie.
Yeah, let's talk about the selfie. I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners would have seen it, but Albanese, amid all this speculation, is he going to get a meeting? Is he not? He posted, on his social media a selfie of him with Trump. Trump has his startling white teeth, and how did you see that selfie as a kind of image?
Well, so the Prime Minister might be grumpy in public when asked about this meeting with Trump. He's clearly sick of the line of questioning. There's no doubt that at some points the media have looked a bit obsessed with it. It is
we
important.
Are obsessed with it.
But his view is that there's hysteria around it. Okay, that's understandable. He likes to criticise the media. He's been comfortable, as you say, Noddy, this week, knowing that there probably is a White House meeting down the track, and that this week in New York has not been crucial. Yet despite that, he still feels the need to get into this room with dozens of other world leaders where journalists and photographers were not allowed, wait for this selfie and post this selfie on social media. Donald Trump's one of the most unpopular politicians among Australians of any global leader. So there's no domestic benefit for him in being seen posing in a kind of superficial, slightly odd-looking selfie with Donald Trump, but he clearly sees some benefit in proving to both his critics in Australia, to potentially sceptical Republicans and people in the Trump orbit who Kevin Rudd is dealing with over there, that A, he's comfortable being with Donald Trump, and that B, he secured the meeting. That was deemed of greater significance than any downside of being in a smiley photo with Donald Trump, and I think that's revealing.
Noddy, what do you think about that selfie?
Yeah, and we don't know exactly what went on in that room. As you said, there was no access to journalists, but the relationship has begun from that moment, as in they'd never met in person before. And Donald Trump is clearly a big believer in first impressions, this instant idea of whether he likes someone or not. He spoke about this in his very long speech to the UN General Assembly. He followed the president of Brazil, who always starts, and Trump has imposed huge tariffs on Brazil. He's really furious at the current socialist president of Brazil because Donald Trump's friend and the former leader of Brazil, who was a right-wing populist just like Trump, is going to go to jail for trying to subvert the election. There's a lot of parallels between Trump and Bolsonaro. So he's not been a fan of the current president of Brazil, but then they had a brief handshake. And Donald Trump said in his speech, we only spoke for 50 seconds, but I think this guy's actually great. We got along really well. We had this instant rapport, and I want him to come and have a meeting next week. This was all just in the space of less than a minute. So that's the way he sees people. So it seemed to be a friendly photo with Albanese. He said before that he thinks he's a good man, and he's described him as a good guy. So
yeah, they've chatted on the phone.
So they're clearly huge ideological differences between them. Just they view the world in such different ways. They don't seem like people who would naturally along. But Albanese has had a good record of having good interpersonal style with fellow world leaders, and he'll be hoping that he can, subtly flatter Trump in some ways.
I wonder if that's what the selfie was about. Was it? I mean, it was a little bit of an FU to, I think you're right, the Australian press corps and all his critics at home. Like, look, here I am rubbing shoulders literally with this guy that you all said was shunning me. But wasn't it also like showing to Trump and Trump's inner circle that he's a fan? He's a fanboy. And so,
Yeah, we're comfortable.
Yeah, so you should treat me well when I come to greet you and meet you and, kiss your ring on October 20th at the White House.
And the PM's got to if you talk to the people who've known him for a long time, who've served with him in Parliament and some of his friends, one of his great abilities is to strike up rapport with characters who he doesn't necessarily get along with politically. He's had a lot of long-lasting relationships with News Corp executives in Australia, with conservative politicians. He actually had a good personal relationship with Peter Dutton, despite obviously not seeing eye to eye at all. It's one of his skills as a politician.
All right, guys. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you both again soon.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you.